Welcome to Waking Mad. I'm Ben Bruce, and I have the wonderful pleasure of talking to Anthony Peake today at the Afterlife Explorers Conference in Melbourne. So welcome, Anthony.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be involved in it.
So you've published heaps of books.
Well, my publishers have published heaps of books.
Okay.
Yes. You know, they're actually properly published rather than self-published. We are the real.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Important distinguishment there.
Yes.
This is the Daemon, a guide to your extraordinary secret self. Wonderful text, opening up a whole new way of perceiving or understanding consciousness. Would you like to just talk a little bit about this book to start with?
Yeah, absolutely. The Daemon was my second book. The first book was Is There Life After Death? The Extraordinary Science of What Happens When We Die. But the Daemon features one particular element of that book. And in my initial book, what I put forward is a hypothesis that effectively at the point of death, we don't move on to somewhere else. What we do is we relive our lives again in a three-dimensional recreation of our lives, like a computer program. And in my later books I've discussed this in greater detail, the idea that this is a simulation, that there is strong evidence from science, there's strong evidence from cosmology, there's strong evidence from various other areas that reality is a simulation and it works on digital processes.
So this reality that we're in right now,
correct,
is a digital simulation.
It's a digital simulation. Well, the evidence is that the propositions are that it is a digital simulation. There's been a lot of work done on this by researchers, serious researchers. For instance, there's a guy called Vlatko Vedrell, who is the professor of quantum physics at the University of Singapore, one of the top young quantum physicists. And he's brought out a book saying that everything is information, that at the baseline, matter, everything is based on information, and it's information that is the most important area. Well worth reading his latest book on this. But effectively, as well as that, there have been arguments for a long, long time that this is some kind of hologram as well. So we're existing within a hologram. The intriguing idea is, and it's very, very good, is the idea that human beings, there's two things. The first thing is a concept called Moore's Law. Now, Moore's Law was put forward in the late 1960s by a guy called Moore. You know, it's really coincidence, isn't it? Moore and Moore's Law. It had to happen, didn't it? And what Moore did, Moore was one of the founders of Intel. And when they were developing microprocessors, he realised that probably the power of microprocessors would probably double every 2 years. And this is Moore's Law. In recent years, it's gone down to about 3, but the law still applies and it's still continuing year on year. And we're only limited by the size of microprocessors. They're getting smaller and smaller with more and more data and more and more information on them. But the logic is that if that is the case, in around about 200 or 300 years' time, the amount of processing information available will be phenomenal. And as well as that, there are new developments in things called quantum computing, which means that you can actually have computers making calculations in alternate universes. It sounds crazy, but it's where science is going at the moment. Okay? If that is the case, our ancestors will have the most amazing abilities to process information. Now, if they can do that and we survive a nuclear holocaust or whatever, it is logical to conclude that we will be able to develop universe simulations. Simulations of universes. In other words, second life, but in a universe. And the argument is, we believe that our ancestors will do this because mankind has always done it. If there's something you can do, you would do it. So they will create their own ancestor simulation. And they will populate that ancestor simulation with simulants of their ancestors. And they will be able to create, to such an extent, to make those ancestors sentient. So in other words, the memories and thoughts and thought process of those individuals will also exist. So effectively, and the argument is that they're almost 90% certain that this universe is a simulation. And the reason we think this is something called the cosmic anthropic principle. The cosmic anthropic principle was put forward in the 1960s by a guy called Freeman Dyson. And what they've noticed is that from the first few moments of the Big Bang, the universe seemed to be hard-tuned, hardwired for the evolution of conscious life. It's as if it knew from the first moments of the Big Bang that there was an end purpose. It's called teleology in philosophy.
Teleology, yeah.
Okay? So, of course, you'd know that as a psychologist. Yeah. And, of course, there is this idea of the end purpose. Now, from the first few moments of the Big Bang, for instance, in order for matter to be created, there needed to be a specific mathematical balance between matter and antimatter. In the first few seconds of the Big Bang, that absolute balance was achieved. We then go further on to the way in which where the molecules developed, the way in which carbon developed, the way in which the universe has expanded in a particular way.
And the odds are very...
The odds get ridiculous. I mean, for instance, the one that always I find absolutely fantastic is that life needs water. Without water, life could not survive. Water is a unique liquid. It is the only liquid that freezes from the top downwards. Every other liquid freezes from the bottom upwards. So this effectively means that on planet Earth there would never be any running water, because it would always be frozen, because it would take so long to freeze, because once it freezes from the bottom, it's going to be frozen a long time because there's no sunlight getting down to there. So life would not have developed. So there's two alternatives. There's either the alternative that this universe consistently got things right time and time and time again for life to evolve, or there are multiple universes. And in fact, there are trillions of universes, and this happens to be the universe, or one of many, that everything coincided. And they're the only two alternatives. It's either the universe got it absolutely right first time, or that there are trillions of universes and we happen to live in the universe that is right for us.
And this isn't actually fuzzy physics, is it?
This is not fuzzy physics. This is physics that has been discussed by top physicists for the last, well, since Dyson came up with the idea. People like John Wheeler have been involved in it. Top physicists have been debating this. And again, if you get a hold of a book called The Cosmic Anthropic Principle, it lists all these things. A recent book came out called The Goldilocks Enigma, and that again discusses this, the weirdness, the way in which the universe seems to be heart-tuned for life. Now, if it is a simulation, that is not at all surprising. You would expect it to be, because a simulation would be created in such a way that this universe is ambient for us, or this particular planet is ambient for us.
So the giveaway seems to be it's all too perfect.
Yes, it's all too, it works too well. Now, of course, there is the alternate argument. The alternate argument is, well, it always will be right. For instance, every lottery, there is a one winner of a lottery. There's a 1 billion to 1 chance that you will win the lottery, but there will be one person who will win, and that one person will think, my God, I'm so lucky. But every time there's a lottery, particularly if it's known numbers that will win, somebody will win. So you can look at the reverse and say, well, we live in this universe because it's the only universe we could live in.
Yeah.
So and therefore, it's not coincidence. They are a series of chances, and by sheer chance, we've got to here. But technically, it does look very, very strange. And even hardline materialist reductionists cannot avoid the facts of the matter that it does seem to be hard-tuned. If it's hardwired and hard-tuned, it means it's a simulation.
Why do you think it's important to have ready arguments, research, evidence for these hardline materialist reductionists?
Because there was a guy called Marcello Trulli, who was one of the original founders of the skeptical movement. And many, many years ago, he came out with a very, very famous phrase, and he said, extraordinary claims need extraordinary proofs. So in other words, if I turn around and I say, I saw my brother John walking down the street, so what? Nobody's going to, if I have a brother called John who lives in the same town, it's not at all surprising. If I turn around and say, I saw a pink elephant smoking a huge joint walking down our street on a tricycle, people would say, don't be ridiculous, that's impossible. So I'd have to go and prove that I'd seen that, because I've made an extraordinary claim. Okay, extraordinary claims then, such as precognition, out-of-the-body experiences, near-death experiences, ghosts, telekinesis, telepathy, all these things are not within the present scientific paradigm, or not explicable within the present scientific paradigm. Therefore, to actually prove them, the demand of proof is far greater than you would on an ordinary science point of view.
So the supernatural, the paranormal.
Correct.
Yeah.
So my philosophy is always that in order for the kind of subject matter we are interested in, we have to do the science. We have to be in a position where we can say to our critics, I have reviewed this, I have looked at this in detail. Now, I've spent my life, the last 10 years, reading every single piece of material I can on quantum physics and on neurology. So therefore, I'm in a position that if somebody wants to debate with me my position on quantum physics, if they're wanting to discuss with me Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, I can. I understand Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. I know what the background to it is. If people want to talk about Schrödinger's cat, if they want to talk about the idea that the act of observation creates the reality around us, I can argue that point because I know why we come to that point. I know why science has come to the point of believing that subatomic particles, before they are observed or measured, are literally a statistical wave of probability. They only become a point particle when they are measured. So for example, that is solid. That is not solid at all. It's 99.999% completely empty space. I think I'm actually interfacing with that surface. I'm not. I'm interfacing with the electromagnet, the fields of energy around it. I never touch anything. That's empty space, and what it is created by, I mean, the whole universe, everything we see and perceive is created from around about, I think, about 10 objects. You have the four quarks, you have up, down, I can't think of the other two, but there's 4 quarks, and there are electrons, and then the force carriers, the bosons, things like photons, which carry the electromagnetic radiation. You have objects that actually carry the weak force, objects that carry the strong force. And then we are now looking for another force carrier, which is the gravitons, which is the force that carries gravity. This is why there was this massive furore when they discovered the Higgs boson, because the Higgs boson is the thing that actually carries mass to everything, okay? This means effectively that what we perceive as reality isn't as real as we see it seems to be. Now, in terms of the act of observation, there's something called the twin slit experiment. And the twin slit experiment is effectively, if you fire single electrons through 2 slits, what you will find is that the electrons seem to go through, if they are not observed, they go through the slits. They go through, each single electron goes through both slits, which effectively means it's a wave. So the electron, which is a particle of matter, this is the thing that people don't necessarily appreciate here. We can talk about photons, but we know that there's a wave function of electrons, which are little tiny bits of matter. Okay? Mm-hmm. If the electrons are fired and they're not measured or observed, they go through as a wave, and what you get is you get an interference pattern on the backward.
Yeah,
okay?
Sure.
If you then...
So theoretically that's when the waves collide.
Correct.
Interference
Yes,
pattern.
it's called interference pattern. So the waves, like when you drop a piece of a stone into a piece of water, the waves come out, and as they spread out, they interfere with each other, and they actually nullify each other, or they expand each other. And
Which is how you can infer that it's a wave.
That's how you infer it's a wave.
Yeah.
However, the great mystery is that under other circumstances, they discover that electrons and photons show particulate. In other words, they seem to be particles. So, for instance, a photon, which is the carrying force of light, electromagnetic radiation, effectively, one of the greatest mysteries was that it was seen time and time again that it's a wave. Light is a wave. It shows wave-type things that waves do. However, the great problem was for the science of the late 19th century was how, if that is the case, does sunlight get from the surface of the sun to the Earth? Because a wave needs a material to wave within. Indeed. You know, a water wave is actually something travelling through water. Without the water, there would not be a water wave. The same goes for sound. I'm speaking to you now because my voice is actually compressing and expanding the air around us. Yeah. So it's a wave in the air.
So you can't speak or hear anything in space.
Correct, in space. Yeah. Nobody can hear you scream, as they said in the movie Alien. Eek. Probably the same in Australia sometimes. So the circumstances here is that the mystery was space is a vacuum, 93 million miles between Earth and the Sun. How the hell does a wave of light get from the surface of the Sun to the Earth? Einstein came along in 1905 and turned around and said there's something called a photoelectric effect, which I can prove mathematically and experimentally, which proves that light is little tiny particles that actually hit a surface and kick electrons out, called the photoelectric effect, and he said, therefore, light is a particle. So therefore then, suddenly Einstein had proven it's a particle, but the thing still shows wave-like characteristics. So light is a wave and a particle. And then a guy called de Broglie, Prince Louis de Broglie, came along in 1926, I think it was, and suggested that electrons also had this kind of wave function. In other words, light can be matter and can be a wave, and so can matter. Matter can be a wave and or whatever. So what happens when these things hit the target and they go through? If they are not observed or measured, they always go through as a wave, always. If you then place a measuring device on one or the other of the slits, so this is absolutely amazing, and people, if they don't appreciate this, not observed goes through as a wave. You want to see what is happening. So you place, because for instance, if there are single particles being fired, single electrons, there are 2 holes. If they are going through the hole, you need to know which hole they're going through. So you put a measuring device on one of the slits. You put the measuring device on the slit, and the moment you do that, the wave pattern disappears, and it goes the kind of pattern you would expect if they were particles.
So consciousness has affected matter.
So consciousness has actually affected, in other words, one would argue, no, it's the act of measurement. But of course, the act of measurement by the measuring device is effectively being observed by a person doing the measuring. So in which case we have the idea, and the Copenhagen interpretation of particle physics is quite precise on this, that the act of measurement and the act of observation creates everything around you. If something is not observed, it is a statistical wave. It's not even a wave, it is a statistical wave. A guy called Born came up with this idea that, because they were trying to understand what kind of wave is this, how is it waving in anything? How is an electromagnetic wave waving in anything? And it's not. You will probably know as a psychologist, when you do your statistics, you have the typical standard wave pattern. You know, you take a lot of statistics about people's height,
normal distribution,
and you'll have the normal distribution.
Yeah.
And effectively, they argue, if you look at the normal distribution, what does it look like? It looks like a wave. And then they said, well, maybe this is the wave that subatomic particles are. It's not really a wave, it's a wave of statistical possibilities. And the wave is, you have a particle somewhere in a box, and statistically it's 99.999% certain it's going to be there, but there is a 0.001 statistic that it could be outside the box. And believe it or not, this is how sunlight works. The sun could not generate light if we didn't have something called quantum tunneling. Really seriously, and quantum tunneling is that, and it's quite a basic thing, but it's quite fascinating. If you have, in the sun, we have light and heat is generated by a particular process like called nuclear fission.
It's fission, yeah.
Okay, and all that is effectively hydrogen atoms turning themselves into helium atoms.
So H2 to H1.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So, and how they do this is that they get pulled together. But the problem is a hydrogen atom only has one electron, and it has its nucleus, which means it's negative. So how do two negative hydrogen atoms come together? Because they're both negative, so therefore there would be the repulse like you have in a magnet. They should not able to ever come together to fuse. And the reason they can do this is because of the statistical thing of quantum tunneling, whereby the particle, statistically there's a 1,000,000,000 to 1 chance that one of the particles will be the other side, one electron will be the other side of the repulsive force. And because there are trillions and trillions and trillions of these particles in the sun, they only need a tiny minority to get through, to get round in quantum tunnel, which brings about then the whole effect where it now changes into helium, and then it generates light and heat. So
through that fission process,
yeah,
or fusion process, yeah. Okay.
So effectively, where we are now is that we were discussing about the nature of reality and the hypothesis where the Daemon came from. I think because I tend to go round a little bit in things, which is one of my problems.
Yeah, diversified interests.
Diversified interests.
You're a conscious being, a very conscious being.
Yes. Which
is fantastic. Actually, if I could just come in there as well, we were talking about at Waking Mad how our mission statement is about making philosophy and science of consciousness more accessible. In fact, making it more sexy.
Yeah.
More appealing. And a lot of things that don't take off or get into the public domain, as it were, are because there isn't enough marketing or PR, or it's not sort of explained appropriately. It doesn't seem relevant to people's lives, and a lot of what I'm hearing from you now is about the implications of this stuff that these materialist reductionists might kind of pay lip service to. It's in the textbooks, it's not even fuzzy physics or whatever, or fuzzy consciousness work. But when you actually look at the implications, and you come in as a sociologist, haven't you, originally?
Yes.
And I believe you even work as a management consultant.
I do. Yeah.
You work with Wimbledon.
Yeah, and so I do work on psychometrics and everything else, and sort of measurements of personalities and everything else.
Yeah. So who would have thought that you would get into consciousness studies, neurology, quantum physics, and yet you have.
Yeah, it's really weird. I mean, just going back to the sexiness of the subject.
The sexiness of the subject.
The reason that the subject I'm interested in is not considered sexy anymore, or has never really been considered sexy, is because it attracts a certain type of personality.
This is consciousness or physics?
Neither. The idea of the mysteries of how consciousness interfaces with reality.
Okay. Yeah.
I am a conscious something interfacing with something out there.
Okay.
if I have an experience, if I have a déjà vu sensation, if I have a precognitive experience, if I have an out-of-body experience, if I have a near-death experience, all these things are not considered to be within the remit of materialist reductionist science.
This is ontology, cosmology.
Absolutely, that they will not accept it. You know, effectively, you will always, if you read books on science, particularly popularist books on science, you will always find the caveat somewhere to say that, of course, telekinesis is nonsense. Of course, believing in these kind of things are nonsense.
Like Richard Dawkins, those sorts of people.
These guys, the thing is with these guys, they are tied to the materialist reductionist paradigm of science, which effectively is, if I take something apart, bit by bit, I can understand it. In other words, if I need to understand what a motorbike does, I can take a motorbike apart and I can understand how the internal combustion engine works, and I can extrapolate from that what it's supposed to do. But using this with the brain, for instance, and trying to find consciousness, it's like taking a motorbike to find speed. You know, it's a different thing. But materialist reductionists will say if you cannot take something apart to find its causes and its reasoning, it doesn't happen. So therefore you can't take apart a precognition in the same way. You cannot take apart an out-of-the-body experience, because the argument is consciousness is an epiphenomenon of the brain, exists within the brain, is created by neurological patterns and neurotransmitters in the brain, which don't exist out there.
It's almost as if consciousness was an accident.
Yes.
It just came about accidentally.
It did. And of course, this is where
And you go back to quantum physics, and it's only through the act of observation, measurement, consciousness that reality can exist.
Exactly.
So how does that work?
Yeah, exactly.
Isn't that a paradox?
Totally.
Total paradox.
And it's a paradox they will argue, they will waffle around, materialist reductionists will waffle around and say, you're misunderstanding the Copenhagen interpretation. This is not what they said, but it is exactly what they said. And they can waffle till the cows come home, but Einstein knew this is what they said, because Einstein made a very, very famous statement many years ago, because he had problems with the Copenhagen interpretation, and he said, I cannot believe that the moon does not exist when I don't look at it. Now, Einstein knew exactly the implications of this. He was quite precise.
He was rather bright.
He was bright. and the thing is with Einstein, he could not accept this. Einstein believed that the statistical interpretation of particle physics was ridiculous. He believed that at a deeper level of reality, solidity was there and reality was there. Whereas the modern quantum physicists say, no, there is no ultimate any makeup of anything. Everything is just energy, and there isn't anything there. And Einstein, in fact, spent the last 20 years of his career trying to disprove this. And I think it was in 1935 he got together with two associates, Einstein and Podolsky, and came up with something, the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen experiment, thought experiment. And without going into detail, he was trying to show that this idea that a particle needs to be observed in order to exist was nonsense. The interesting thing is about this, though, and again, most scientists will avoid this fact, is that in 1964, an Irish physicist at CERN called John Bell wrote a paper about the EPR paradox and basically concluded mathematically that Einstein was wrong, and that these objects, he basically said Einstein said that there could be two objects, and if they were entangled and placed in a certain way, if you believed the Copenhagen interpretation, it would mean that one would be able to communicate with the other instantaneously. It's very difficult to go into details.
The entanglement.
It's entanglement.
Yeah.
And the instantaneous communication, which would then violate the speed of light, and therefore violate everything about science. Bell comes along, does his calculations, and mathematically shows that Einstein was wrong, and these particles will be able to communicate. But what is little known is that in 1981, a guy called Alain Aspect at the University of Paris Optics Division did a series of experiments with another guy called Dalibard, and they actually reproduced the EPR experiment and proved it actually happens. These particles do instantaneously communicate. That should have been...
So the entanglement principle is valid?
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
Not only is it valid, I mean, I thought that would have been headlines around the world, and it wasn't.
Astounding.
But it's even weirder, because there's a guy called Anton Zeilinger at the University of Vienna. He's been doing experiments with entangled particles for the last 15 years, and he's been able to entangle big buckyballs. A buckyball, Buckminster fullerene, it's a big soccer ball shaped atom of molecule of 60 atoms, and it's shown this wave particle.
So this isn't even quantum anymore. This is
molecular. This is molecular.
Right.
Correct.
Yeah.
So we now have molecular physical objects that effectively, if they are not observed, are a wave.
So quantum principles are actually affecting larger matter.
Well, this is the big issue,
Larger matter.
is at what point does quantum weirdness become Newtonian sensibility? At what point is that you can have two particles at the same, one particle at the same place, two particles in the same place, this kind of thing. The argument is out because they're getting bigger and bigger and bigger molecules that they're seeing this. I think the latest one has about 500 electrons in it. So at what point does the change happen? And of course there are weird substances like Bose-Einstein condensates that actually are physical objects like a laser that actually can show this wave-particle duality. On top of this, most scientists will never ever tell you this, but they don't have all the answers. There's one huge mystery. We have two models of science at the moment. We have quantum physics and we have relativity. If you take the maths from quantum physics, which deals with the very small, and you post the mathematical formulae into Einsteinian physics, it doesn't work. They get infinity, they get crazy answers. So it means that we got two explanations, both of which are scientifically valid, that contradict each other. So there has to be a deeper answer to this. And this is where the work of people like David Bohm comes in. And David Bohm was an Anglo-American quantum physicist who came up with what he called his hollow movement. And this is Bohm who's suggesting that this is again the idea that this is a simulation. Not only this, it's working under the principles that we already understand in terms of holograms.
Right.
And he has something called enfoldment. And I don't know if you're probably aware of this. If you take an image, a holographic image, and you smash it up into little pieces, it's not like a normal picture. If you take a picture and you rip it apart into little bits, what you'll have is a part of the picture in each section.
Just a piece, yeah.
In a hologram, that doesn't happen, as you probably know.
One part contains the entirety.
It contains the entirety.
It's like yeah, sure.
So in which case, we have here enfoldment. We have the idea that William Blake said to see heaven in a wildflower. Literally is correct. The tear in your eye contains the Andromeda Nebula, the Andromeda Galaxy.
The tear in your eye contains the Andromeda Galaxy.
Yeah, and
that's pretty sexy. How could that not be sexy?
Yeah, how could it not?
I've got to ask at this point, what is wrong with people? Why is this stuff not sexy?
I'll tell you what.
I've got an intellectual boner the size of the planet. I mean, pardon my French.
I think I'll now leave. We're on a balcony somewhere in Australia.
Can't get out.
And I'm guy. Look at this guy with an intellectual boner. Dear me.
So what's going on with people? What do you think about
What
this?
I think is happening is that people are educated within the system. In other words, when I was doing my physics at school, and when my wife was doing her A-levels in physics and everything else, we are taught the standard model of how the world seems to work, which is based upon a rigid materialist reductionism, and it is based upon science of 110 years ago.
110 years old.
110 years old. It's at least 110 years old. That's what our
Talk about obsolete.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
Totally. These are things before the quantum revolution took place in 1900. The science... There was an arrogant statement made by a scientist in about 1897, 1898, where he turned around and he said, the whole of science, we're within a couple of decimal points. I think it was Michelson, the American scientist. Within a few decimal points and we'll understand everything. There are only two black clouds on the horizon, the black body effect and the photoelectric effect. Once we've explained them, we know everything. Max Planck, the physicist who caused the revolution, was told by his PhD tutor in the 1880s that don't go into physics because we've almost sourced everything out. There's no point, there's no future in physics because we've got it all sussed out. And of course it was Max Planck who in 1900 said there are certain observations about black body radiation that don't make sense. And the only way I can make this understand is that energy is not continual. It comes in little tiny packages called quanta. 1900, bang, the revolution occurs. 1905, Einstein comes along with his theory of relativity. Bang, suddenly everything changes. But we're taught in schools the basic Newtonian principles.
So if we were to take a Foucauldian perspective, so those who, in a sense, own knowledge or control it, if you are the authority on something, we can't get away from the economic and power privilege that brings.
Oh, totally.
And therefore, are they biased from the dispute?
I think it's simpler than that. Putting a sociological hat on it, it's simpler than that. Okay. It's if you've invested most of your life in proving you are somebody important within an academic structure, you don't want the world to know that you don't know as much as you'd like to believe you know.
So it's identity based.
Great.
It's who I am, and all of a sudden all my work is nonsense.
You know, suddenly when Alain Aspect did the experiment in 1981, I will guarantee there were thousands of scientists around the world that suddenly thought, shit, how do I equate this? So let's pretend it didn't happen. And what they do is they talk to each other about these things. I mean, for instance, you can read New Scientist or anything, and they will have, for instance, around about 6 or 7 years ago, the front of Scientific American had a headline, "Is the universe a hologram?" This was Scientific American.
Scientific American.
Yeah, and this is this is the real deal. People don't like it because they like certainty. They like the idea that I understand what's going on, that there's nothing weird about anything. But if we start to look deeper, and this is why it's so interesting. For instance, each human being on this planet is a conscious something having a conscious experience. Modern science denies that. There is something called eliminative materialism, and eliminative materialism argues that there's no such thing as self-referential consciousness. Your consciousness is fooling itself into believing that you are anything. There is nothing going on in your head. You're being fooled. Now, this is people like Daniel Dennett and Patricia Churchland and her husband. These guys control psychology. You're probably aware of this.
Interestingly, I've become disillusioned from the mainstream academic psychology. Disillusioned. I don't necessarily think it's going to go anywhere for me anymore. It's too obsolete. It's holding us back.
Well, what it's doing is it's still having rats in mazes. It's still not got over the kind of positivism of the 1930s. You know, the Talcott Parsons, you know, the rats in a maze, the salivating dogs, Pavlov. You know, all this stuff is where they're working from. But of course, the reality is, consciousness is created in some way within the brain, or the brain's processing information from somewhere else, and they're in denial about that. That, you know, from St. Juno in psychology, you have the problem of the binding problem. How does everything come to? Where does everything come together in the brain? But everything's distributed. Different parts of the brain do different things. But we have a feeling of continuity. We have the feeling of being here and now, perceiving everything as a unity. That cannot work in our modern understanding of neurology and modern understanding of the physiology of the brain. So the consciousness has to be distributed through the brain, and the only way it can be distributed if it works on holographic principles.
So do you think, Anthony, that consciousness is A, not what we think it is?
Correct.
And B, do you actually think that we're a singularity?
Yes. Very much so. I'm very much, probably the listeners out there, or the listeners out there are probably, well, the watchers, isn't it? Sorry, the watchers. God, that sounds something like a Marvel comic, doesn't it? They're watching us. Yeah, there used to be an amazing Marvel comic many years ago called The Watcher. I think.
Yeah, The Watcher.
Watchmen. Yeah, absolutely. Dr. Quantum, why is he blue? Yeah. So going back and go off on tangent, sorry about that. Where were we? We were discussing singularity is the idea of consciousness as a singularity.
Which means we are all one.
Correct. Bill Hicks came up with the American stand-up comedian, the very great stand-up comedian, once came up with this fantastic monologue where he turns around, and I'm paraphrasing, and he says, and it's a newscaster, and he's turning around and he's saying, breaking news, young man on the streets of Houston, Texas, suddenly on acid, suddenly discovers that matter is in fact energy slowed down to a particular speed, and that we are all one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively. Very interesting. Well, back to Jim with the weather. And that sums it up, doesn't it? You know, you go, wow, and then it goes away somewhere else. There was a recent example of this. There's been some experiments done recently that they were talking on British radio about. And again, it was, I think it's, I can't remember what the scientific discovery was now, but it was astounding. And the newscaster just went straight to the sport, didn't miss it. But the idea is that we are one consciousness experiencing ourselves subjectively. In other words, within the program, the logic is, with this idea is, imagine that you are God. Okay, and you are God, and you are this being that is here forever. It must be pretty damn cool being God, because you've got all eternity to do what? You've already made everything, so what do? You've got to be interested in something. So you create this simulation, and you have creatures in it called human beings. And you think, you know what? I'll have a bit of fun. I'll go down into that simulation, and I'll be Anthony Peake. And I'll forget I'm God, and I'll wander around and live in this soap opera. And I'll write books, and I'll be interviewed in Doncaster East by Australian guys. and I still won't know that everything around me is a simulation. And then when I die, I can go back and I can be Robert Bruce, and I'll live his life, and I won't know who I am.
It sounds plausible, actually. However, there's got to be something masochistic about that, because if you have a peak samadhi experience in meditation or something like that, and you experience a singularity, I mean, that's that oneness state, the samadhi
which
state, the yogis do.
Atonement.
Yeah. It comes with this sense of extreme joy, usually, and love, usually. If you leave that and come into this amnesic incarnate in flesh, with a sense of identity which is based on separation, it's like a little child losing his mother at the department store.
So it's masochistic. Yeah, I can see that.
And we lose that joy and come into this suffering, really.
Well, maybe that's it.
What's the value of suffering then?
We can only develop. Effectively, there is the counter argument: is that you can only have black with white. The suffering within the simulation is because you are alive, and it helps you develop. It helps you to develop yourself. You find throughout life, because one of the reasons I wrote my first book was that I was intrigued by the idea.
And this is cheating the ferryman.
This is cheating. Well, the concept in the book is called Cheating the Ferryman. The actual book is called Is There Life After Death?
Is There Life After Death?
And what I was intrigued about was that I spend all my life having all these experiences, all this learning, everything else, and then I die, and it all goes to waste. So then you think, oh well, but there's things like reincarnation. You can be reincarnated. And I thought, hold on a minute, what's the point of that? I die, I get reincarnated as somebody else, and I don't even remember all the experiences I had in the other life, which means there's no iteration, there's no development there. And my hypothesis is, when you die, you live your life again as yourself. You come back as yourself. You live within the simulation as yourself. But at that time, and this is where we get right back to the second book, The Daemon.
The principle of the Daemon.
Is that when the second life goes around, there's part of you that remembers the fact you lived your life before. It's the game player. When you play a computer game, you're the game player, you're the Daemon, and on screen you have a sprite that, say, Lara Croft. What happens? You switch the game on. First time you play it, Lara's there in the cave, looking at you, and you follow her. She was great to follow, wasn't she? And you follow
rather.
You follow her down the corridors. Follow her down the corridor, and then she goes down one side of the corridor, and you take her down, and there's a big monster there. Bang, she's killed. What happens to her? She's dead. But you take her back to the start of the game, and she's reborn again. And you think, well, yeah.
Like magic.
Yeah, magic. She comes alive again. She doesn't remember the fact she's been born again. But you do, as the game player, you're the Daemon. Then you send her down the corridor and you go, shit, do not go down that corridor, Laura. Do not go down that corridor. So you go, how can I communicate with her? And this is where the opening of the doors of perception comes in my latest book.
So this is your next book that's going to be published. It's Opening the Doors of Perception.
Opening the Doors of Perception, which will be out in September this year.
And it's sort of almost like an opening up of the subject of Aldous Huxley?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So effectively, what I argue is that the Daemon is the game player and you're in the game. The Daemon tries to guide you through your life as best it can, because of course it only knows what happened in the last game. It doesn't know the story of your whole life. All it knows is how to get you out of the thing that killed you last time. And understandably, when you play these games, the fun of the game is learning the layout of the scenes that the game is. And when you have these simulations where there's a whole world that you can travel around and walk around, because I've always argued that if there's any game developers out there who want to develop this as a game, we'd make a bloody fortune.
So therefore we get better every time.
It's Groundhog Day.
But an improvement upon itself, an evolution.
It's an evolution. So what you do is, and I always use the Groundhog Day analogy on this, the movie.
The Bill Murray movie, yeah.
The Bill Murray, because one of my biggest fans is Danny Rubin, the guy who wrote Groundhog Day.
Oh, what?
Danny and I have been in contact. I've interviewed him on my own radio program. And Danny and I have discussed my principles within Groundhog Day. In Groundhog Day, Danny told me that the character, he was going to have him live 6,000 days. And if you remember in that movie what he does, first time he realises that he has the advantage over everybody else because he's knowledgeable of what happened the day before. So he tries to bed the girl, he tries to do all these things and use it for advantage. He then realises he can use it for knowledge. And of course you have all those wonderful sequences where he tries to kill himself.
Yeah.
And again, Danny told me,
he gets fed up with it.
Danny said he had great fun with the script because he thought, how many times you can kill yourself? Like that wonderful line. And funnily enough, I was down in Melbourne a couple of days ago with friends of mine, and we were driving along the road, and you have the tram lines.
Yeah.
And I was thinking of Groundhog Day, where he turns around and said, when you're a kid, your mum says you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that, you shouldn't drive on the train lines. And his mates in the car going, no, you shouldn't actually. So he killed himself many times, but he came back, and then he starts to do good for doing good's purpose. He realises that there's a kid that's going to fall out of a tree and break his leg, so he's underneath the tree. It's Buddhism. It's samadhi. It's actually growing and doing good for doing good's sake. And I believe this is what happens here. We come back and we live this life in the simulation that has programmed in it every outcome of every decision you can make. And again, guys, this is quantum physics. Look up something called the top-down interpretation of quantum physics by Frank Hartle and Stephen Hawking. Don't take my word for this. This is what Hawking and Hartle say, is that in the wave function...
And Stephen Hawking's not to be trifled with. I mean, this is a major...
serious guy. Yeah. And this is Stephen Hawking's attempt to understand the collapse of the wave function. And he says that the wave function, everything that can happen is encoded in the wave function, and every decision we make collapses that part of the wave function to follow the reality forward to accommodate your decisions. All the other decisions are still there in a statistical, but they've not been collapsed. But other people can collapse those alternate realities. There's another guy called John Kramer who has something called the transactional analysis of quantum physics, and that is that, as you're probably aware, positrons are actually antimatter electrons. And there's an argument to say that antimatter is matter travelling backwards in time.
Wow.
So reality is created, the wave function is created by electrons going forwards in time and positrons, antimatter electrons, going backwards in time. And when they hit each other, they cause an interference pattern. And everything we see is the interference pattern being caused by things going backwards and forwards. So again, and positrons, you know, many of you out there have had a positron emission tomography. Is something we do.
Yeah, the PET scan, the medical imaging.
They're using antimatter. They use, you know, people think antimatter is science fiction.
And this is what I was saying before, it's the implications of all of this research and understanding and bringing it together into work. What I'm seeing in your work is a unified theory. You're bringing it together to create an ontology, a rendering of a cosmology. And the nexus, the interface between consciousness and the universe is very intimate. And would you agree that we're not some freak show accident in the boondock of the Milky Way on some random planet and consciousness happened to emerge because of chemical accidents over the evolution of millions of years? I gather you don't agree with that view.
No, absolutely. Well, for instance, your own philosopher, there's a very famous Australian philosopher called David Chalmers. Yeah. David Chalmers said back in, I think it was the mid-90s, at a conference in Arizona, when he turned around and he first suggested his ideas, what he called soft and hard problem consciousness. Soft problem is, can we vaguely understand the mechanisms of consciousness using the neurological constructs we understand? That's the non-hard problem. The hard problem is how consciousness is created by the brain, how something completely non-physical is created by physical processes, and we're not even at first base about that. However, if you take my point of view and the point of view of the philosophers and the scientists I follow, we don't need to explain it. It's consciousness that brings the physical reality. It's the consciousness is prime, and the
consciousness is prime.
Consciousness is prime.
Yeah.
Now, every single philosophical and religious viewpoint from the beginning of time have come to this conclusion. You look at the Kabbalah. What's the Kabbalah actually arguing? If you go down to basics, everything is one thing. It's called the Or Ein Sof. That is the backdrop of everything, and we are all emanations of the Or Ein Sof. You look into Sufism. Sufism has exactly the same concept. You look into Gnostic Christianity, and you have the idea of a singularity. Buddhism has the same. Brahman in Hinduism. It is all the idea that this is an illusion. It is Maya, as the Buddhists, as the Hindus say. You look into the deeper philosophies of Buddhism, like the Bon tradition in Tibet. And in fact, in my book, The Infinite Mind Field, which is my second to last book, I discuss the role of dimethyltryptamine and the pineal gland.
So this is the molecule present in ayahuasca?
Correct.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. DMT is in ayahuasca, DMT is in many plants, DMT is in your blood, DMT is in your liver, and get this, 18 months ago, a lady called Jimo Borigin at the University of Michigan actually discovered it in the brain of live rats. So when people turn around to you guys and they turn around and they say, DMT has not been discovered in a live brain, bollocks, it has. They know it has, they're just not talking about it. In which case, if DMT is found in the pineal gland of a live rat, it means probably that DMT is generated by the pineal gland. And if DMT is generated by the pineal gland, this will explain certain anomalies like the TARS receptors, trace amine associated receptors in the brain. They're actually designed to work with DMT. You know?
So we are designed to be visionaries.
Correct.
We are designed to have spiritualist experiences, samadhi, bliss, and so on.
Well, as Rick Strassman, the guy that wrote Spirit Molecule, said, he believed that the actual reality modulator is DMT. This is what creates, it facilitates the illusion.
Indeed. Anthony, I would love to talk with you for a light year. This is one of the most fascinating conversations I've ever had the privilege of being a part of, and I thank you very much.
Thank you.
I am also aware that you need to be on stage very soon,
oh God, yes,
doing a live presentation for a couple of hundred people or what have you. So
yeah.
I just wanted to thank you very much for coming on to Waking Mad, and it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Oh, it's been wonderful. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk to you. It's really great. Thank you.
And thanks for watching Waking Mad, the Consciousness Project. Thanks for joining us.
Bye, guys.